Hey guys, welcome back to another morning of quarantine, coffee, and Jesus. We're in the final stretch of the book of Colossians. The back half of this fourth and final chapter is basically Paul saying hi and giving shout outs to a bunch of different people. So let's get into it. In verse 7 and 8, he greets this guy named Tychicus. He says this: Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. He's a dear brother, a faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. I'm sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. Tychicus is only mentioned 5 times in the New Testament. It seems that he'd known and worked with Paul throughout his ministry. He was likely from Ephesus, and he was the mailman. There was no postal service in the Roman Empire. Sometimes the army or traveling merchants would deliver mail, but most often you had to find someone to take it for you. Perhaps they were already going in that direction. Roman roads were good and revolutionary, but they were also dangerous, often littered with thieves. And obviously there was no tracking your package. You just hoped that your letter survived the journey as you waited to receive your reply. And this is how most of the New Testament came to be: letters delivered to these scattered house churches. And it's a miracle that we have them. It's also possible that Tychicus worked as a scribe for Paul, helping him to write down these letters to the churches. So if we put all that together, what kind of person is Tychicus? Well, he had courage, he was trustworthy, and he was a servant. Paul says as much in verse 7. And so the question is, why are we talking about Tychicus on the other side of the world 2,000 years later? And it's not because of anything extraordinary that he'd done, but instead it was because of who he was, because of his character. And this was a really challenging and encouraging thing for me to think about this week. How do I measure success in my life? By accomplishments or faithfulness? Paul is trusting Tychicus to represent him, to update the Colossians on everything that's been happening to him. And Tychicus's, that's hard to say, his credentials, his credibility is his character. And that's how we'll remember him. The writer George Eliot said this: "The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts. And that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." Paul is such a towering figure that it's easy for us to lose sight of people like Tychicus, Paul's secretary and mailman. Through his faithfulness, God has blessed the church and the world, including this little campus in Aurora, Colorado. Is a legacy of faithfulness something that I would be satisfied with? The next person Paul greets is a man named Onesimus. In verse 9, Paul says this about him: he, Tychicus, is coming with Onesimus, say that 10 times real quick, our faithful and dear brother, who is one of you, and he will tell you everything that's happening here. Paul doesn't give us a lot of information about Onesimus, but Paul does describe him as a faithful and dear brother who is one of them. He's a follower of Jesus, part of the family of God. The significance of that will become clearer as we learn more about his story. We read about Onesimus only one other time in the 3rd shortest book in the New Testament, the book of Philemon. And we're going to spend the rest of our time there so that we can learn more about Onesimus. It's a really beautiful story, and it pairs really nicely and helpfully with the book of Colossians, as you'll see. So flick ahead, find the book of Philemon, or look it up in your app, and we're going to spend the rest of our time there. It was written to a man named, you guessed it, Philemon. What do we know about Philemon? Well, he was a wealthy landowner, lived in the town of Colossae. He met Paul sometime, someplace. We don't know exactly where or when, perhaps in Ephesus, because Paul had never visited Colossae, and those two towns are only about 120 miles apart. Wherever they met, Paul told Philemon the good news about Jesus, and Philemon became a follower of Jesus. And that faith led him, along with a few others, to start a church in his home. We know he was wealthy for 2 reasons: because he had a house, and it was a house big enough to hold a church in, and he owned slaves. And I'll address this a little bit more later, but for now, and we did cover this last week, so in case you missed it, slavery was a significant part of life in the 1st century Roman Empire. It was common. One writer I read said that owning a slave was as common and as much a part of everyday life as cars are for us. And I don't want to pretend to know the specific nuance of what it was like, but I'm led to believe it was different to the situation of slavery in America, so it's probably not wise or fair to just think about them as the same thing or treat them with the same cultural baggage just because we're using the same word. But of course, there are similarities. It was also terrible. Slaves in the Roman Empire were treated as subhuman, less valuable, and with less human dignity than others. And they were vulnerable to a lot of abuse and mistreatment. If you have more questions about that after this and after what Cole said last week, feel free to reach out. But for now, I'll leave it there and we'll keep on learning about Philemon. He owned slaves, and one of those slaves was a man named Onesimus. His name meant useful. Onesimus wanted out of the life of slavery, so he took what he could from his master's house, he stole, and he escaped. And this was a big risk for Onesimus because it was illegal for a slave to run away from their owner in their master in the first century. And the punishment was anything from being beaten to being killed, perhaps in some cases crucified if your owner was particularly ruthless. And it seems likely that Onesimus escaped to a big city so that he could become anonymous and run away from his past, maybe Rome or Ephesus. We don't know exactly, but somehow in his running, Onesimus ran into Paul. And Paul told Onesimus the good news about Jesus, and Onesimus became a follower of Jesus. And then Onesimus became very important to Paul. Personally, Paul calls him his son, his child who he'd fathered. He calls him my very heart and someone very dear to me. Paul says that Onesimus had been very useful to him. Prisoners at that time had no access to amenities or food, so it's likely that Onesimus ran errands for Paul, helped and supported him while he was in prison. At some point, and again, we don't know when or how, Onesimus confessed his past to Paul. And it turns out that Paul, even though he hadn't visited the town of Colossae, he knew it, and he knew Philemon, the man who Onesimus had stolen and run away from. Now it would have been easier for Paul to just hide Onesimus away, keep him around the prison, or send him on a mission trip to Spain. But Paul's life had been changed by the God whose entire mission is centered around reconciliation. Remember in Colossians 1, starting verse 19, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, that's Jesus his son, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So this situation becomes a test case. Does this message of reconciliation work outside the lab in the real world? In the context of such a powerful social structure like slavery, is the gospel more powerful? Even powerful enough to reunite a rebellious slave and his master? Can they move from being fractured to being in fellowship? And so the decision is made at risk of death by capital punishment to send Onesimus back to Philemon. But Onesimus doesn't go alone. He's accompanied by Tychicus and this short letter that Paul wrote that we now know as the book of Philemon. Now this letter may be short, but Paul uses this small amount of words very skillfully. And I'd recommend finding some time today to read through all 25 verses because it's lovely. And I only have time to give you the highlights package. So from the top, Paul starts with a greeting, but he swaps out his usual title of apostle of Jesus to prisoner of Jesus. And this is the only time in the New Testament that he does that. And I think it's strategic. From the beginning, from the start, Paul is reminding Philemon that there is a master, but Jesus is the real master in this story. Paul goes on to greet Apphia, who he calls his sister. She's likely Philemon's wife. And he greets Archippus, who he calls a fellow soldier. That could have been Philemon's son. And Paul also greets the church that meets in Philemon's house. If this reconciliation is going to work, if the church is going to stay united, then everyone needs to be involved. And I'm sure there'd been a lot of talk about what Onesimus did to Philemon, and the whole community would have had good reason not to trust him. But that notwithstanding, Paul's main focus for the rest of the letter is Philemon, his dear friend and co-worker. He identifies Philemon as a man characterized by love who has refreshed the hearts of the saints. Paul's in a really difficult situation. He stands between these two men and he loves them both. And Paul knows what the right outcome is. He thinks that Philemon should forgive Onesimus and be reconciled to him. And as an apostle, as a leader in the church, he has the authority, the right to tell Philemon what to do. But that's not what he does. Instead of, like he says in verse 8, commanding you to do what is right, in verse 9, Paul appeals to Philemon on the basis of love. And why is he doing that? Because Paul is an ambassador, a prisoner of Jesus. Paul is following in the footsteps of Jesus, laying down his rights and authority to lead both Philemon and Onesimus to reconciliation. Paul is concerned pastorally for both of these men. He wants them both to be more fully formed humans as they act more like Jesus. Finally, in verse 10, Paul names Onesimus. And Paul is not appealing on behalf of the old Onesimus, the escaped thief and slave. The Onesimus that Paul is writing about and sending back to Philemon is not the same man who stole and ran away. Onesimus has met Jesus and has been reborn. In Christ, he's become a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. And it must have been such a surreal moment for Philemon as Onesimus, this man who stole and ran away from him, stood before him, and all those emotions, probably a lot of anger, rising up inside of him while he is at the same time reading this letter from Paul, his spiritual leader, as he writes these words about Onesimus. Paul says, "I appeal to you, Philemon, for my child, Onesimus, whom I fathered, a part of myself. He was useless to you." Remember, his name means useful, so he's making a pun. John Meeting, if you're there, that one's for you. He was useless to you, now he's useful to both of us. Paul wanted to keep Onesimus around because he loved him and he valued his help around the prison. As I said before, in verse 13, Paul says this, "I wanted to keep him, Onesimus, with me so that in my imprisonment he might serve me in your place." Now, maybe Philemon was too busy working his land and leading the house church to help Paul in person. But Onesimus, the useless one, had been doing the work that Philemon hadn't been able to do. Onesimus had been serving Philemon by serving Paul, even though he didn't realize it. And then verse 14 is really beautiful. Before Paul comes out and tells Philemon directly what his appeal is, he says this, "But I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that any favor you do would not seem forced, but would be voluntary." Paul wants to treat Philemon with humanity, dignity, and agency. He doesn't want to act like, slave master, shouting orders at a slave. He respects and loves Philemon too much for that. And we're starting to see some shades of the golden rule here. Is he asking Philemon, what does it look like to treat others the way you might want to be treated? Paul, in fact, treats Philemon like a free man. And Paul also doesn't want to rob Philemon of the joy of coming to the decision himself, because he knows it will be better and more satisfying for him in the long run. So then from verse 15 to 22, we get to the heart of what Paul's asking for and appealing to Philemon to do. And here are the 4 appeals, and we'll walk through them real quick. The first is, Paul says, "If you consider me your partner, then welcome, receive, and accept Onesimus." Paul's saying, if you take me, then you need to take him, and not as a slave anymore, but as a dearly loved brother. And remember back in Colossians 4, Paul described Onesimus as one of you. Paul is saying to Philemon, he's one of us. He's in the family, so accept him. Second, he says, if he's wronged you, and it seemed like Paul wouldn't have said that if there wasn't a very good chance that he had, charge his debt to me. And that's really beautiful. And then in verse 19, Paul gets a little bit cheeky. He says, not to mention, Philemon, that you owe me your very self. Remember, Paul had led Philemon to Jesus, and here is his chance to pay Paul back. And Paul thought it would be an appropriate time to remind him of that fact. So accept him, charge his debt to me. And then 3, Paul says, refresh my heart in Christ. Philemon, I want some benefit from you in the Lord. Be useful to me, like Onesimus has been useful to me. And he's pointing back to verse 7, to Philemon's character. He's a man who has refreshed the hearts of the saints. And Paul's saying, be that man again to me now in this situation. Refresh my heart in Jesus. Reconciliation is the narrow road to refreshment for all involved, and there aren't any shortcuts. And then 4th, Paul says, I'm confident of your obedience, that you'll do the right thing. He says that in 21. And then the very next verse he says, but also prepare a room for me. When I get out of prison, I'm coming back to check up on how well you welcome Onesimus. Now, Paul isn't commanding Philemon to do anything, and yet he isn't leaving any room for interpretation, and Philemon will have to give account for how he handles the situation. And that's basically Paul's approach. And it's interesting to note that this letter doesn't contain any explicit explanation of the gospel. And that's because in this story, we see the gospel message lived out in the lives of these 3 men. Paul stands in the middle with one arm around Onesimus and one arm around Philemon, like Jesus stood in the gap between heaven and earth, between a holy God and rebellious people. Paul, like Jesus, served at great cost, and he gave up his rights as an apostle. Like God the Father, Paul gave up Onesimus, his child whom he loved. And Paul personally took on the debt owed by Onesimus to Philemon, so both men could be free like Jesus did on the cross for us. It's so beautiful. And we don't know how this story ended. We don't know how Philemon and his family and the church there that met in his house responded to Paul's letter. But it seems like they responded well, or else we probably wouldn't have the letter. But this whole situation is such a beautiful expression of what the gospel can do. First of all, it's uniting such a diverse range of people. A mailman secretary, a Jewish rabbi, scholar, tent maker, a wealthy land and slave owner, and a slave and thief. We see in this story men, women, rich, poor, slave, free, Jew, Gentile, all united in Jesus. It's so beautiful. And this isn't some nice theory Paul had. This is the power of the gospel working in real life. And Paul's approach makes me think of that old saying, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, but teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. Paul isn't just telling these men what to do. He's trying to get them to think and live Christianly. So I think the takeaway, challenge, encouragement that Paul has for us is, how do we do that? How do you think Christianly? How do you model the message of the gospel, the message of reconciliation in your life? And to help us think through that, I just want to finish by walking through the three main characters in the story and putting ourselves in their shoes for a moment. First of all, Paul, what would it mean for you to lead like Paul in this situation? I'm sure there are moments and opportunities in your life, or there will be, where you are leading people. What does it look like for you to lay down your rights and preferences and to lead at great personal cost to yourself, in your family, in your church, in your wider community, at your job? It takes security and strength to allow and help people to think for themselves. What about when you engage politically? Think about some of those hard issues that we're facing, abortion, climate change, sex trafficking, and a bunch of others. What's more costly? What's easier, to go somewhere and protest, to picket, to spend your money, to yell at people on social media, or to vote in a certain way, or to change your behavior and to walk alongside someone whose behavior and struggle is making a problem worse? And often the answer is both. Almost always it's complicated. Paul's been accused of not speaking up enough directly against slavery in the first century, and I wonder if the book of Philemon is his response. Paul was put in prison for publicly declaring that Jesus is the true king, not Caesar. And King Jesus treats people as humans with dignity and agency. Slavery has no place in his kingdom. And Paul, at great cost to himself, as we see in the book of Philemon, modeled this in the churches he was leading. Paul was bold and courageous, but he was also humble and patient. And that takes some confidence in a God who will ultimately set the world to rights and punish those who commit injustice. The gospel has the power to change the world, and it does it one heart, one relationship, one family, one community at a time. Like Cole said last week, Paul sowed the seeds for the destruction of this evil social and economic and political structure of slavery. And then I would add, it paved the way for Christian leaders like William Wilberforce in England in the 18th and 19th century, and Martin Luther King in America last century, who both waged successful political campaigns against slavery. What does it look like to lead like the Apostle Paul, and ultimately to lead like Jesus? 2, what would it mean for you to be like Philemon? I'm sure there are situations in your life where you have more power in a relationship. What does it look like for you to use that power wisely and humbly, and to treat people who have less power than you with dignity, as human beings made in the image of God, so that they can flourish, to be fair and just, and to show grace, to lay down your pride and sense of justice and self-entitlement. However history might judge Philemon for owning slaves in that specific time and place that he lived, under the law of his day, he was in the right. The law was on his side. He had every right to punish Onesimus. What would it look like for you to recognize that even though you might be a master in some particular situation, that spiritually you too were like Onesimus and the younger brother in the parable that Jesus told, who ran away from his father's household, who wished his father dead and took his inheritance, but then by grace was welcomed back? And what would it look like for you to treat people who you have authority over the same way that you would want your master in heaven to treat you? What would it look like for you to act like Paul wanted Philemon to act in this situation? And then third, what would it look like for you to be like Onesimus? To lay down your fears and make yourself vulnerable to face the consequences of what you've done wrong. To do everything you can, everything within your power, with the help of Jesus, your church family, and your new heart, to make things right. To have the humility to ask for forgiveness and to accept the gift of someone else on your behalf. This is a really beautiful, but also a really hard story. Reconciliation always comes at great cost, but the price is always worth it on the other side, because it's a sign that heaven is breaking into this world, that new creation is here and is coming. So, and this is hard, who do you need to be reconciled with? And what's your next step? Reconciliation is always messy. Two of the names that Paul lists at the end of Philemon signify broken relationships. One is Mark, who abandoned Paul early in his missionary journey, but was then restored to Paul. And then Demas, who Paul later writes about in 2 Timothy, which was his last letter before he died. Demas abandoned Paul because, as Paul said, he loved the present world. Paul knew what it was like to be abandoned and to deal with messy relationships. So that knowing reconciliation is hard and messy, it's not surprising that Paul bookends this letter with praying for the grace of the Lord Jesus, the one who holds the power over reconciliation by the work he did on the cross. Paul prays that same Jesus, that same grace would be with the people, these men, Philemon and Onesimus, and the church at Colossae, in this very difficult situation. And that's my prayer for you as you wrestle with how to apply and live out this great little book in your life and relationships. That's it. Love you guys. Have a great day.